Thank you for joining us, especially during a very busy summer week with naps and other programming that's happening. So welcome to Eric Ruins the Magi. This is a live workshop and interview with Dr. Eric Vanden Eykel, and I will get to the structure of this afternoon's program in a second, but before I do that, I just wanted to make a couple of announcements. First is you can check out Urbs and Polis on any of our social media. You can see that at the bottom of your screen. And secondly, I want to make an inclement weather announcement. Eric and I both live in the New River Valley. We are expecting severe thunderstorms this afternoon. So if we lose the live stream, you should know that we are going to pre-record and we will have this interview up on the blog within the week if that happens. So when we conceived, I'm Shaily, by the way. I'm Shaily Patel. I am assistant professor of early Christianity at Virginia Tech. Let me give Eric an opportunity to say hi.
Sure. Thanks, Shaily. I'm Eric Vanden Eykel. I'm an associate professor of religious studies at Ferrum College in Western Virginia, and I wrote a book on the Magi.
He did. We're going to talk about it.
Yeah.
So we conceived of this workshop, or rather I conceived of this workshop and then sort of press ganged Eric into participating. But we conceived of it as a kind of inside the actor's studio, but for academic writers. On the one hand, we wanted to spoil some of Eric's forthcoming book, The Magi, who they were, how they've been remembered, and why they still fascinate, which will be out October 18th, 2022. You can pre-order from Fortress. Yay! But I also wanted an opportunity as an ECR to talk to Eric about his writing process and how we get from idea to a real book that lives out there in the world. So I think these sorts of questions are really good for those of us who are working on our first books, for example. In terms of structure, here's how it's going to go. I'm going to start with a quick summary / review of the book's purpose. Then I'm going to ask Eric some content-related questions, basically making him give up the goods before publication. The back half of the session is going to be focused more heavily on writing-related questions. We'll hold 15 minutes at least at the very end of the hour for open Q&A, so feel free to drop those into the chat as we're talking. And for those of you who have never joined us before for any of our programming, you should know we are a fairly informal bunch. So please don't be shy with comments and questions. We're happy to take them. Today, again, I'm Shaily Patel. Today, we're really lucky to have with us Dr. Eric Vanden Eykel, who is Associate Professor of Religion, as he said, right up the street at Ferrum College. Eric earned his PhD in Judaism and early Christianity from Marquette University in 2014. And a lot of you know Eric as a fearless critical scholar whose work, both academic and public-facing, disrupts ancient and modern ideas of canon and canonicity, highlights Judeophobia in early Christian texts and legacies, and lays bare the ideological and apologetic stakes that are at play when biblical texts are invoked in modern debates on abortion, COVID, and white Jesus. So it's not surprising then that Eric's forthcoming book gives us the same ethical historiographical work that we have come to expect. Eric claims the book, The Magi, is a reception history of the figures we know from the birth narrative in the Gospel of Matthew. The three wise men of elementary Christmas plays everywhere, the ones who come from the East, bearing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And while these figures aren't given much space in Matthew's text, they do have a very long and vibrant history in subsequent Christian literature. Part of this is the work that Eric does in the book. But I would argue that this book is more than just reception history. It's also part biblical commentary, in that it gives us a fresh way of understanding Matthew's Magi that isn't caught in the intellectual trap of trying to determine why these figures are evaluated positively when other figures with similar titles, like Simon Magus, Bar Jesus, are evaluated negatively in the biblical text. Now, of course, we're going to spoil how Eric accomplishes this scholarly negotiation in this interview. But I want to bring it up now in the beginning to foreground one of my favorite things about this book. It's that it shatters stereotypes that we may hold about writing for broader audiences. Because while it certainly distills the state of the question for lay people, it also makes a unique and meaningful scholarly intervention for those of us who work in biblical studies, early Christianity, and Greco-Roman religions. And that, too, I would argue, is something quintessentially Eric. His work often makes impacts well beyond the ivory tower. So naturally, the Magi does as well. And I think we'll see what these impacts are as we get into the meat of this interview. So what I'll do is I'm going to stop right there. And once again, just thank Eric for joining us. And unless you have anything, Eric, we'll get straight into the questions.
Oh, thank you so much. Those are wonderful, wonderful compliments, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. So I sent Eric a whole bunch of questions. We'll see how many we'll get through. Again, feel free to drop your questions into the chat. So just hopping right into it. In your prologue, you talk about how you started thinking about this project right after you finished your dissertation, which impressive. I didn't think about anything. Over your sort of, because you put years of research into this project, right? So over these years, you found that extant scholarship on the Magi generally falls into two camps, right? One is the same stuff that we've read over and over in commentaries. And two, you call them like completely off the wall ideas, right? But you're doing something different in this text. So give us the goods. What is your take? How is it different from other approaches on these figures? And why do you think it's important to rethink the figures of the Magi?
Yeah, thank you. I think the way that I frame it is sort of more of the same or a bit nutty, and those really are the two options. And if you do any kind of searching around online, you find all sorts of stuff about who the Magi were and who. And I see a note. Let me know if my audio is okay. But in biblical commentaries and these sorts of things, you see a very particular understanding of the Magi as, the story is there to foreshadow the conversion of the Gentiles, or, to kind of show that Christianity would become a Gentile phenomenon rather than a Jewish one. And of course, Matthew is writing, after that's already happened. And so people have sort of assumed that's what the story of the Magi is supposed to be. And so as I sat in the library, kind of just doing the biblical commentary thing and looking at all of these commentaries and seeing this just over and over and over again, and of course, those of us who do biblical scholarship, this is what commentaries do, right? They just sort of, this commentary summarizes everything from the previous dozen commentaries or whatever. And so I wasn't terribly surprised to see the same thing over and over, the same biblical passages, the same typos. There's a false quote citation of the Aeneid that creeps into commentaries, and I'd love to go back and see where it originated. But anyway, just more of the same. And okay, hold on.
Yeah. So we are getting a little bit of crackle. You may want to try headphones or shift your mic a little bit, Eric.
Okay. Let me see if I can go grab some. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Hold on a second.
Right. So while Eric is doing that, again, I just want to invite you all to visit our all of our social media, Facebook, Instagram. It's at the beginning of this video. We will also throw it up at the end of the video. And I'm happy to drop questions this early into the chat if they're there. And we will just hang on just a second for the audio to come back.
right, Shaily, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Is it better?
It's better for me. If somebody would drop into the chat if it's better for them, let us know.
Okay.
So when we left off, you were talking about how commentaries are, and this is how commentaries work, right? Like they just cite
Right.
the last 10 years of commentaries. And so we have this trajectory of scholarship that's really commentaries citing commentaries citing commentaries, right? And so talk about this other trajectory of scholarship that's just off the wall.
Yeah, well, and I wouldn't even call it a trajectory of scholarship, and I hope my audio is better right now. But I mean, there's just all sorts of just insanity out there, and a couple of these things are in book form, but a lot of them are just blogs and other media. And so, you know, the Magi are, you know, ancient aliens following a following a UFO or something like this, or, you know, ancient brotherhoods and these sorts of things. And a lot of the crazy stuff really is sort of predicated on the idea that the Magi had to have been real people, and so to kind of figure out exactly who they actually were. And I think we'll get to that question a little bit later. But my primary concern, though, was to address this issue really of like the whole point of the Magi story as being the Gentiles come to see Jesus, right? Which then leads to the really unfortunate Judeo-phobic interpretation of the Magi story, which is that the good Gentiles come to Jesus and the bad Jews just want to kill him. So as I started thinking, though, about why I didn't like this interpretation, what I finally came to realize that it's just boring, and it's boring, and it doesn't even start to scratch the surface of what the Magi story is there for. So as you know, Shaily, and as everyone is about to know, you know, the word Magi in ancient Greek, in first century Greek, this is not a neutral term. This is not like, you know, people from down the block came to my house. Like if Matthew was trying to, let's put it this way. So if we look at a story like the flood in Genesis, if we come to the conclusion that the flood stories in Genesis exist to tell us where rainbows come from, like that's it, right? I mean, then that author has completely overtold that story. Like, really? Rainbows come from God murdering everyone.
Yeah, that's a lot.
And then there's a rainbow, and that's where rainbows come from. Well, like, does that story explain the rainbow? I mean, sure, but also like there's a lot more there. And so so this idea of like, oh, the Magi are Gentiles. I mean, sure, maybe, but maybe not. And I think that there's a lot more that could be said about the story. And so that's kind of where the meat of this book came out, is to say, okay, rather than talking about just the Magi as Gentiles, which is about the most boring thing you can say about them, let's talk about the Magi as Magoi, right? And that's this word Magoi, which I've chosen to translate as Magi. And so, yeah, sort of pushing back on that idea and saying, maybe Matthew imagines them as being Gentiles, but there's so much more that story is doing in Matthew.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's one of the discourses of magic that I talk about as well, which is, you know, this discourse is polyvalent. It's never just doing one thing in one text, right? And so to make sense out of it, you really have to have a sense of the broader ways in which that term is used. So let's stick with that term. And I know that this is a trick question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What is the difference between the Magi and magicians like Simon Magus and Bar Jesus?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, you know, as you know, I talk about this a bit as an example of, you know, Acts is a first century text written roughly around the same time as Matthew. We won't get into the dating weeds, but yeah, there's these two characters who are thoroughly negative for the author of Acts, Bar Jesus and Simon, who's later called Simon the Magos. And so, what's the difference between these two characters and the Magi and Matthew? I mean, really, it's just the perspective of the author, because they're all called the same thing. And so, we kind of get the sense, and I think this is probably accurate, we probably get the sense that Matthew imagines his visitors positively. There's no real sense that they're nefarious or that they are power hungry or anything like that. But that's not the case for the author of Acts. For the author of Acts, Bar Jesus is a false prophet, and Simon Magos is he wants to buy the works of the power of the Holy Spirit or whatever. And both of these characters are cursed by the apostles. And so really the difference is the way that these authors imagine that value-laden term.
Yeah, and it goes to show that, again, right, like this, you can't just, the translation is not, and we'll talk about translation a little later, but translation is not this one-to-one correlation, right? Like just because we're translating this term magician in Acts does not necessarily mean that, the Magi in Matthew's gospel have the same sort of semantic, I guess, meaning as how Luke would use it in Acts. So it is important to sort of think about how each author is working with this same larger discourse, right? So I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about something that I know is really important to you personally. It's important to a lot of us very personally, and that is Judeophobia. Something you highlight in this book is how this story, the story of the Magi, is used to uphold Judeophobia, like you said, right? Like it's Gentiles come to see Jesus, and Jews can't be bothered, right? Like that seems to be how it gets spun out in later Christian texts, all the way up to 1915 and later. Like you do this longue durée of reception history. So I guess one of the questions that I had as I was reading the advanced copy is, why is this story so prone to being leveraged in Judeophobic discourses?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I think the Judeophobic kind of thread is old. It's very, very old. And so, you see it in some of the earliest receptions of the Magi. And it does then run all the way up until the present. And I've heard, plenty of Epiphany sermons that have been, I'm hearing crackling again. Is that right? Oh gosh, I'm so sorry, y'all. Is it the same type of crackling?
It's affected by you moving a little bit. So, okay,
hold on.
That's better, I think.
Is that better? Okay, I'll try to stay as still as possible.
We still have a little bit of crackling, sorry.
Okay, that's fine. Let's see, how in the world?
Apologies for the technical difficulties. As I said, we're both in the middle of thunderstorm alley today.
Yeah, okay. Let's see here. Okay. Still crackling?
Yes.
Okay. Let me see if I can just unplug and see if it does it through my laptop mic again. Sorry about this, y'all.
No worries.
Okay, so is that working now?
That's better.
Okay. We'll try that for a little while. And I'm not even
to make it work.
Yeah, I'm not going to even use my headphones. Right? Okay, so we'll try to move as little as possible. Okay, so let's see. So the Judeophobic interpretation is very, very old, and so it doesn't really start with anyone particular. It just it's just sort of there. So I think it's important to preface that the Judeophobic interpretation of this story is probably not uniquely suited to Judeophobia. It's sort of the case that once you see once you see Judeophobia in early Christian literature, you sort of see it everywhere. And so the unfortunate thing is that this, the Magi is sort of one example of that kind of Judeophobic read of like the good Gentiles versus the bad Jews. But I think one of the reasons that this story has been maybe particularly prone to it from an early stage is the kind of mystery and the foreignness of the Magi, of that terminology, Magi. And so, these are sort of, when early Christian authors are looking at, who are these characters, one of the kind of default, who are they at a very basic level? Well, they're foreigners. I mean, and they are, right? That's sort of, they're from the East. They're from somewhere else. And so I think especially if you're reading a story like this, after the so-called parting of the ways, when Christianity has become sort of Gentile movement, then maybe that's sort of the default easiest interpretation. But yeah, it's pervasive. And, one of the places that it popped up, which I was really, really just heartbroken to see it pop up, was a children's book that I closed out the last chapter with, where, it's not only in the text of the children's book, it's in the illustration as well, of like the good Magi and the bad Jews. And it's a children's book by an Episcopal priest who's pretty regular. Books are pretty regularly read in mainstream seminaries. So it was very, very disappointing to see that in a children's book. But I'll let y'all wait to see who it is when the book comes out. But but
yeah, it is. I mean, it's one of the things that I picked up on as I was reading too, right? Is as we work in biblical studies, like we know this interpretation, this Judeophobic interpretation. I just didn't realize how pervasive it was in later literature. Yeah,
it's everywhere.
Yeah. So we talked about this Judeophobic interpretation of the text and how it's just everywhere up until now, right? We're seeing it in children's book. But you also write in the book that there are, quote, 4 more interesting ways to make sense of the Magi story. These more interesting nuances, for me at least, came to light when you started to contextualize the story within the Septuagint and also, broader Greco-Roman literature. So I guess I'm asking you for a spoiler. Will you spoil some of what you found when you expanded the scope of your research in this way?
Sure. Yeah. So, looking at, that kind of that question of, okay, so let's peel back the layers beyond just the Magi are Gentiles, and let's look at what it means to read the Magi as Magi. And one of the things that I found there's a pretty meaty survey of primary texts that I think people will find interesting, and Herodotus and primarily, but then a lot of others as well, Philo and Josephus. Was the Magi in the first century, kind of second century and previous, are very much stories about them are almost always stories about them involve proximity to kings and to power, political power. The Magi they're advisory figures. Sometimes you have stories in Herodotus of the Magi being manipulative, kind of politically manipulative figures. But really, I mean, the common thread that runs throughout that is that they are drawn to positions of power. For whatever reason, they're drawn to positions of power. You find them in the king's court, and you find them among royal advisors. And then in addition, right, they're also religious ritual specialists, sacrificial, the priests, all these sorts of things, as well as diviners, right? They discern special significance from things like stars, right? Or dreams. Most often dreams. So the sort of spoiler alert to how I understand them in my chapter on Matthew is I highlight what I call the political nature of the story and kind of tease out this idea that the Magi story, the star, the Magi coming from the east, all of these things are meant as a commentary on the illegitimacy of the kingship of Herod the Great. And now, of course, when Matthew is writing, Herod has been dead for a long time, 80, 90 years probably. But the Magi show up and they're looking for the one born, the king of the Judaioi. Now, we're not going to argue here about how we're all translating Judaioi, because that's a big conversation. But in this book, I translated it as the king of the Judeans, because Herod the Great is the king of the Judeans. And he is given this title, though, by the Senate of Rome, because Herod is not a Judean himself. He's an Idumean. And so when the Magi show up from the east and they say, we're looking for the one born king of the Judeans, what they're essentially saying is, we're looking for the one who's actually the king of the Judeans, not you. And Herod, sort of in Matthew, seems to agree, because he says to his advisors, he says, where is the anointed one to be born? And so this is, very, very clearly a story about the legitimate heir of David and the king of Judea. And so I think that fits very, very nicely in with the Magi, as in these ancient sources. The presence of the Magi means that they're in the presence of the legitimate king. And so that's sort of the one side of that spoiler. Now, the other side of that spoiler is the rhetoric of the star, which we saw his star at its rising. Now, the commentaries, I go to those commentaries again. The commentaries. I
love the commentaries on the star.
I mean, really, in one of these days, we'll do a whole thing on how the commentaries are basically all just plagiarizing one another. I'm sorry if anyone's here who's written a commentary, but that's we can do better. Anyway, the commentaries all connect the star with Balaam in Numbers, and the star will rise out of Israel, and all of this sort of stuff. And they just sort of say, yeah, Matthew's probably referencing this, but no, he's not, because if he was, he would say this took place in order to fulfill this.
That's
now,
right.
It's possible that he has that in mind, but like, Matthew's not a subtle author, and so when Matthew is trying to connect something, or he wants his readers to connect something with the Septuagint, he tells them this happened so that this would be fulfilled. He doesn't do that in the Magi story. And so he's probably, this rhetoric of the star is probably drawing from Balaam. It's probably drawing from Isaiah. It's probably drawing from all of these other sources that talk about stars connected with rulers. And so, when a star rises, that means a new ruler has come to power. When a star falls, like in Isaiah, the king of, take up this taunt against the king of Babylon, behold, you are fallen, O day star, right? And that's a sign that ruler's rule has come to an end. And so there's sort of a political nature of that star too. Jesus's star has risen. But I also make the case that it's not only a polemic against Herod, but I think it's even more prominently a polemic against Rome, because Rome is the empire that gave Herod his title. The Senate votes him king of the Jews, king of the Judeans. But also you have this iconography of the Julian star, the star of Caesar, the star that shows up and is visible in the afternoon after Caesar's assassination. And it's a sign that Caesar has become a god. And so I don't know if Matthew is sort of really leaning into that, but he's participating in that rhetoric, and his readers most certainly are also understanding it in that rhetoric, because they are recognizing probably the language of the star from the coins that they're using, from the iconography that they're seeing on imperial temples and these sorts of things. And so the Magi story then, in my read, is a sort of critique of the unjust and illegitimate political structures that Matthew is familiar with.
Yeah, and this is what I thought was really interesting and why I really love the book, right? Like, because if we just read the Magi as these guys are Gentiles, here in this text to talk about like, oh, Jews couldn't even recognize their own king, right? We miss all of these resonances that you sort of pull apart by doing this sort of deep work. So I want to talk about the importance of writing about fictional characters. We both write about fictional characters. I'm pretty clear when I write about magicians that I'm writing about stereotypes. Yeah, both of us, we obviously think that it's important to write about fictional characters, right? Otherwise we wouldn't do it. So I want to hear why because you're very clear in the book, right? Like, we don't know, there's no evidence to suggest that this is a story that happened. And yet it has this long legacy. And so I'd like to hear why the fictional Magi are so important, even though there's no evidence to support the historicity of Matthew's account.
Yeah, and and I'll just be very clear, just to kind of fill that out a little bit. Very early in the book, I try to be abundantly clear that I personally don't think that these are historical characters. I don't think that there were real Magi. But also, I also think I made it very clear in this book that it shouldn't matter, and that's the really important thing. So the book is not. If you were joining in hoping for a book on the historicity of the Magi, this isn't it. But also, the book is also not about disproving that the Magi. The point is, it doesn't matter, and so you should still be able to talk about the meaning of the story without worrying whether it's a quote unquote historical story. Does Matthew think it's historical? I don't know. It doesn't matter. Really, is the point. It just doesn't matter. Some of my best friends are fictional characters. So, so why are these characters important? And I mean, in many ways, it's kind of a mystery to me why. I mean, you have visitors to Jesus in the Gospel of Luke as well. You have shepherds. Nothing like the Magi, nothing like the cult of the Magi exists for the shepherds. Nothing. And I mean, there's some stories about them here and there, but you just don't get the same level of engagement with these characters. And so, so in many ways, they're fictional characters, but they're figures of historical consequence because of how obsessed people get with them. And so, when people keep thinking about them and keep trying to figure out who they were and keep trying to sort of apply them to new things and depicting them in iconography, and so I think the reason why they're important and the reason why it's important to kind of understand them, or at least to try to understand them, is simply because they're important. I mean, and that's kind of a weird thing to say, but I think about this as an analogy being like the Kardashians. Why are the Kardashians famous? Like, nobody can give a good answer to that. Like, they're famous because they're famous. And so, like, why are the Magi important? Well, I mean, they're important because they're important and because the tradition latched onto them, and they're still kind of changing, and people are still apparently writing books about them. So, so they aren't historical, or at least not necessarily, but I would say they are fictional characters who sort of become real in the tradition, and they become very much real for people who are thinking about them.
Yeah, it's something I tell my students, right? Because students always want to know, like, did this really happen? And my answer to that is always, that's the wrong question, right? The question is, enough people believe this thing to have happened. Enough people believed this to be important that it becomes part of larger Christian history. And as a historian, like, that's where we want to focus, right?
Right.
Because
Focus
there's a lot of stuff that we just can't prove. What are you going to
exactly, and focus on what's available to you, which is the text,
right,
and the traditions. So yeah.
So so we're in the back half of the interview, and I want to talk about writing now. So let's switch gears and talk about process. Now that we have some content to sort of hang the talk of writing on. So when we write dissertations, and I'm asking you this because I know that you started this book like the day after you wrote your dissertation.
Like 3 days down.
So when we write dissertations, we're sort of trained to elevate our own work by talking about how everybody in the history of the field has always been wrong about this thing, right? Like, right. I mean, that's why dissertation is terrible, but like everybody has been wrong about magicians, which of course is not right. So I noticed in this book, though, that you're able to navigate quite deftly between critique of existing scholarship, like the commentaries on top of commentaries, but also distinguishing your own interventions. So how do you write collaboratively with the scholars who've come before you, even when you don't agree?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the, I think probably one of the things that might unsettle some people about this book is that it really is, it is not a book about what other people have said about the Magi. It's very much a book was designed to be written by somebody who has sort of immersed themselves in the material and has something to contribute to that kind of discourse. But my engagement with other scholarship, there's certainly footnotes in the book. There's plenty of footnotes, but my engagement with other scholars is happening mostly in footnotes, occasionally in the body of the text where it's sort of, pertinent to bring in guest lectures or whatever into the scene. But yeah, it's a very different genre than writing a dissertation, which you're right. It's sort of exhaustive, if not showing how everyone before you was wrong. Dissertations are sort of designed to situate your argument, however large or small, within the broader context of like everything that everyone's ever said about anything, right? And so,
right.
and that's one of the. I mean, to be completely honest, I know I've told this story before, but I mean, one of the reasons that I chose to work on my dissertation on the Proto-Gospel of James, aside from the fact that I was very interested in it. Initially, I was going to write on Luke, and and the thought of having to navigate the history of scholarship, even in the past 5 years, because I'm working on Luke. Well, who isn't really? And so so I didn't just choose my topic because not a lot of people had worked on it. I chose it because it was really interesting to me, but that was a really nice kind of fringe benefit is I was allowed to, whatever. So yeah, I mean, how do I navigate that? Well, I certainly do disagree with people, and that will become very clear to anyone who has, who's paying attention. There's only 2 or 3 spots where I actually come out in the footnotes and say this person is wrong, or in one case I say, this person's entire project is just fatally flawed. But yeah, overall, I mean, I think just trying to sort of focus on my own argument, which is informed by all of these others, and to say, if I don't have to actively disagree with somebody if I say, the star isn't an identifiable astronomical phenomenon. I don't have to actually say, and here's all the idiots who think that it was, right? I can just leave that and say that it wasn't this. Here's some things to think about, and that can stand. Now, would it stand in a dissertation? I mean, no, probably not, because dissertations are different sorts of beasts, and they are, I mean, without getting into the merits or lack thereof of dissertations, they're designed not only to put forward an argument, but they're designed to show that you have a mastery of where that argument fits. And so, this book is written with that different aim in mind of saying, let's not focus on what all of these people have said about the Magi, what all of these scholars have said about the Magi. Let's bring them in when it's relevant, but let's more focus on the Magi themselves.
So one of the things that we've talked about behind the scenes is that the project has changed as you've been working on it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really fun to talk to colleagues about how their projects change, or like what gets left on the cutting room floor as like deleted mm-hmm. scenes or outtakes. So like, tell us about your outtakes. How did this project change from how you conceived it to what's on the page now?
Yeah. So there's at least 2 chapters that didn't get written. One of them is a more interesting story than the other one, so I'll tell you about that one.
Oh, we have urtext.
What's that?
Do we have urtexts of the book?
Well, this one never got written, but the plan is still there, and one of these days it will be. So originally there was going to be 1 chapter on the Magi in material culture, and so the Magi in art, iconography, and other things. You'll see the clippings though, because the clippings from that chapter ended up as anecdotes at the start of a lot of the different chapters.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I talk about, one of my favorite places in Rome is the Priscilla Catacomb. And in the Priscilla Catacomb, you have a really old painting, a fresco of the Magi, like 3rd, 4th century, and then also a loculus cover that has the Magi carved into it, which is now in the Vatican Museum. So originally there was going to be an entire chapter on the Magi in funerary art, so sarcophagi and these sorts of things. And I had been planning that chapter since I started doing the kind of plotting for this book in 2014. And in summer of 2020, I was planning a trip to Rome because I was very much not going to write a chapter on the Magi in sarcophagi and these sorts of things if I hadn't had a chance to actually be with these artifacts, photograph them, think about them, be able to just get really close to them and all of that sort of stuff. So I planned this lovely trip to Rome in summer of 2020. Y'all following along here. And then lo and behold, we became a world health risk. So I wasn't allowed to travel, and nobody was really. So that trip got canceled. The following summer, I had plans to go back over to, try it again. That trip also got canceled. But then also, I read 2 books in the summer of 2021 that convinced me to not write that chapter. They were both books by Nicola Denzi Lewis, and if Nicola is here right now, I will say everything I'm about to say is positive. I read first her The Early Modern Invention of Late Antique Rome, which is just a brilliant book. And then I also read her earlier book called The Bone Gatherers. And a lot of books make me feel inadequate in my own abilities. Those two books just knocked me right on my back. And I realized in reading them, I mean, not only is she just absolutely brilliant and just a phenomenal communicator in writing, but I realized just how much left I had to learn before I could write a chapter and publish something on this topic. And so I was looking at those and going, you know what? I don't think I can do this, not right now. And so I just sort of scrapped it. And I think that was a conversation I had with my own ego, and I sort of think with these days with the death of expertise happening almost daily and publicly, it's really important that we are honest about our limitations. And so after I read those 2 books, and also then after 2 trips to Rome were canceled, then I just decided, you know what, I'm going to focus on what I do, what I can do, which is texts. And so I'm going to do that in this book. And I did go to Rome this last summer. I was there just 2 weeks ago, actually. And I got to go visit my sarcophagi, take lots of pictures. And so one of these days, those clippings will resurface maybe as a conference presentation or something like that. But yeah, that is how this book has changed a lot, was a couple of chapters that didn't get written just because of my own limitations.
Yeah, I feel you. I'm a text person too, right? So that's one of the cuts that I made is I'm not talking about material culture related to historical magicians.
It's hard. Yeah.
You're right? Like it's tough. How do you do that when you're not necessarily trained in material culture? So I do appreciate hearing that from you, because I was like, ooh, this is going to be a big cut. But yeah, sometimes you have to cut things.
You do.
So we are on the 3:45 mark. This is the time that I had hoped to set aside for audience questions. Feel free to drop those into the chat. And if you don't drop those into the chat, I will continue pelting Eric with the questions that I've written. So there are no questions in the chat as of now. And because there are no questions, moderator's prerogative here. Right. So because of this recent, I'm sure you've heard, and I'm sure everybody has heard, because of the recent New York Times piece on Haiti, there's been a lot of conversation about citations and whether or not public-facing work needs them. You talk a little bit about this. I'm going to answer that question. I don't want you to waste your time with it. Yes, you should cite your work. All right. But the bigger question to me was, so I know that we were talking about citations on academic Twitter and elsewhere. the bigger question to me was audience, right? And so I want to talk to you about audience for this book. So firstly, how did you choose the audience for this book? Like, so what made you want to write it for broader audiences as opposed to doing what, you know, we would consider a traditional scholarly monograph?
Yeah. Well, and that was a whole process of, you know, after I kind of hatched this idea and started doing the research and, you know, just kind of sat with it for years and thought about it for years, I kind of went back and forth on, is this going to be an academic monograph? Is this going to be something that anyone can pick up and read? And ultimately what finally settled me on just like writing for a public audience, was when I was talking with my editor at Fortress. And this was before I had even, I mean, I suppose he wasn't my editor at the time. He was just a colleague and a friend. And so I was talking with him and one of the questions I said was like, I don't want to write you $100 book. Like I don't, you know, or rather, sorry, what I said was, listen, I don't want this to be $100 book. Like I already have a $100 book. I already have a book that I can't afford to buy myself, which is so depressing, right? Like I can't even afford to buy this thing. And so I said, I don't want this to be a $100 book. I want this to be a $30 book. And he said, and this is a pretty close to a direct quote. He said, if you want a $30 book, then write me a $30 book. And I said, okay, what does that mean? And he says, well, you know, and then he sort of started walking me through like, well, you know, if every other page is like filled with footnotes and all of these kind of minutia, then it's not going to sell as well. So write me, if you want something that's going to be cheaper, write me something that'll sell. And so it's like, okay, great. And so really it was just sort of a practical sort of, you know, doing that. Now in terms of how in terms of how that changes writing, I think the biggest challenge, because I want this, right, to be a book, like I want this to be a book that all of these people who are here right now, I hope they pick it up at SPL this year, and I hope they read it on their way home, and I hope they like it. Read it. Something. Yeah, I hope. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, I hope they read it. I hope they love it, and it's all of that. But I also like. So I want my friends in the guild to be able to understand this book and learn something from it. But I also want my neighbor to be able to read it. Just, you know, whatever. And so writing with that audience in mind, that was a challenge that I sort of had to learn along the way. And you know, time will tell the extent to which I've been successful in that. But you know, the hardest thing I think about writing with a more popular audience in mind is knowing how much background to provide and how much, you know, because the sort of clarity issue is always there. But like, you know, I have in this book almost an entire page on what is the Septuagint. Right. I could have written probably 5 pages on what is the Septuagint, but that would have exhausted my, you know, my other kind of camp of readers. So figuring out that balance, I think, was the big one. Okay, so I see a question.
Yeah, Emily has a question. This is a great question. How does this research change the way that you teach intro classes?
Oh goodness.
Which is a great question.
It's a fantastic, yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. And I think that it certainly has changed the way that I approach material, because having to make a detailed book length argument about an episode like this, 12 verses, right? It's sort of like leading in what's going into this story, what's coming out of this story, has sort of alerted me to the need to do that with more of the episodes that we talk about in class, and sort of give that background. I also want to, you know, so I guess to answer your question, I think it has affected the way that I'm teaching classes. I think that it probably, I think that it's probably helped me to clarify what I'm actually doing when I'm in class and helping students think through stuff, if that makes sense. But also I think to sort of flip the question as well, and to ask it from the other angle. I think that my students are probably the people who have taught me the most about how to communicate to a non-specialist audience, because I think for those of us who teach undergrads, but also some graduate students, I think there is this question of like, how do I take this material and get them to understand it? And so there is this kind of need to sort of communicate and be clear. And so many times when I was writing the various chapters in this book, I was thinking about my students and thinking, okay, so how would I explain what I'm doing here? How would I explain this to them? And so I think it's sort of a mutual, that question goes both ways, I suppose, is what I'm saying. So I hope that answers your question.
If I could take part of that question too, I know we're interrogating Eric here, but I also, when I read this book, I was like, oh, this is going to teach. And the reason that I thought, oh, this is going to teach is because one of the things that I'm always trying to impart to my students is exactly what you said, right? Like, we can take one pericope and write volumes on it. And I think for my students, they don't automatically understand how many discursive resonances are in any given piece of text, right? And so one of the interesting things that you do here is you say, like, oh, we can open this up. We can talk about reception history. We can talk about, this discourse of magicians in the ancient world. We can talk about this Septuagint text. And so I think for me, what a project like this does is, like, it's a solid, like, a tangible thing that I can show students and say, hey, you can write a whole book on these 12 verses. This is true for any given 12 verses in the text, or 2 verses in the text, right? So, when you read the text, let's read for how the text fits into larger discourses, and then how it contributes to later discourses. And most of my classes are about that. So, like, finding a book that I think my students will like reading, and finding a book that illustrates that point. Man, Eric, you made my whole summer. I was so excited.
Awesome.
Any other questions from people? If not, I'm going to continue to be authoritative and ask the questions I want to ask. So one of the questions that I didn't get to in terms of content was the philological question, which I think is important, right? But for both of us, the Greek word we translate as magician, magos, only appears in the New Testament 3 times, and that shocks people when I tell them. It's in the story of the Magi in Matthew 2, that of Simon Magus, Acts 8, and the Bar Jesus episode, Acts 13. And so, like all scholars who work with this term, we know it's loaded with so much baggage. And so the work of translating that term, we have to think through how we're going to translate it. And so we see Matthew's Magoi being translated as wise men or astrologers. You've decided to translate it as Magi, capital M. Could you explain your translation decision?
Yeah. So it's funny whenever I think about, the Bar Jesus, the Magos, I sort of like imagine what would it look like if we're talking about translation as a one-to-one consistent sort of thing, like, the wise man Bar Jesus, right, which nobody would ever translate that story as referring to Bar Jesus as the wise man, or even
because he's characterized as the opposite of wise.
Right. He's a damn fool, as they say. So I think that actually might be Paul's exact word. But anyway, no. So that was a question of going through and saying, okay, what would be the best way to do this? And so astrologer is one of the options that's in, I think I take 6 major English translations. Astrologer is one of them. Wise men is one of them. And neither of these are really good, right? Neither of them are really good. So I sort of sided in this case with the NIV and the NASB, I think. My memory is going away now which one it is. There's two translations that do just straight up lone translation Magi. And so I decided to follow that as a way of simply preserving the mystery a little bit around these characters. And let's pretend that we don't know who they are, and let's pretend like we haven't already made up our minds of who they are. So let's just call them Magi. And I think that my hope is that will help people to say, okay, these are they aren't astrologers, they aren't wise men. I mean, maybe they're wise, but Matthew doesn't really seem interested in their wisdom. So
what does wise men even mean?
What does wise men even mean? I mean, there's another. I mean, sophoi would be a great, that word occurs as a wise person, right? So that would be fitting. But these are something different. And so, and I also wanted to avoid magicians from the East came to see Jesus, or sorcerers from the East came to see Jesus, because I didn't want to load this with negative connotations either, because I don't think that they are supposed to be negative. I think they're supposed to be mysterious, but I don't think they're supposed to be negative. So I stuck with Magi as a way of just preserving that and saying maybe some words are better just left untranslated. Now, why did I do Magi with a capital M? So the NIV does Magi with a capital M, and there's a lot that I don't like about the NIV, but there's also plenty that's fine about it. And I actually like that decision a lot, to just stick with Magi with the capital M, because I feel like in Matthew, this is a proper noun, right? So Magi, they came from the East, and so to sort of recognize that, but then also to distinguish the Magi in Matthew from all of the other Magi that I'm talking about in the book, like Bar-Jesus and right. Simon and Daniel and all of them. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I like the idea of preserving the mystery, right? Because the book is about how do we identify these figures and what do they mean, right? And so, right. Having this term that sort of preserves that and saying, okay, what if we don't know what this term means? How do we then think about it? I think that's important. And you're right, like magician doesn't give you that, right? No. Even though the Greek is magos.
Yeah. Well, and today, right? I mean, sort of as we're talking about translating, we need to be choosing words that not necessarily that have that one-to-one correspondence, but magician today, it sort of is a person who's doing tricks, right? And that's that just doesn't really work for who these characters are.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
So we are at the last couple of minutes, and if there are no other questions, I just want to take a minute and just thank Eric Vanden Eykel for joining us today, and giving us time again over the summer, right? Also, I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. I know it's a hectic time and a lot of people's schedules. And finally, just one last plug for Urbs and Polis. We do a lot of these information sessions. We do a lot of interviews and things like that. You can see all our internet homes at the bottom of your screen. So please subscribe, follow. You can also pitch to write for us. We would love to have voices, particularly ECRs, people from marginalized communities. We would love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your ideas. All right, and so with that, I think I'll wrap up. Thank you again for coming. Thanks, Eric. Anything you want to say to wrap up?
I just want to thank you, Shaily, and Mark is in the background running all of this stuff.
Thank you, Mark, for running everything. Yeah.
And thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to hear what you think about the book, and and I hope you'll let me know.
Yeah. All right. Bye, everyone. Have a good afternoon.